So let's get on with the first session now. And we welcome on stage the following panelists: Dr. Sebastian Maurstraw, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Dr. Jamila Mahmud, who is online, Professor Tan Cho Chuan, and His Excellency Suryo Pratomo. Mr. Sean Xiao is the moderator for international collaboration and partnerships.
Good afternoon, Deputy Prime Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. There are many things we still don't know about the virus. It's mutating as we speak. One thing's for sure, the virus doesn't know boundaries. It doesn't distinguish between continents, borders, nationalities, or ethnicities. The truth is that no one is safe till everyone is safe. How do we fight against such a virus? We must surely rely on collaboration and partnerships, as what the Deputy Prime Minister talked about. It appears that many people are convinced of this. Let's look at a survey. I'll begin with a Pew Research Center survey published last August. I'd like to call up slide 1. It looked at 14 countries and how the people actually view international cooperation. Let's have slide 1. Okay, there it goes. Overall, 59% of respondents believe greater international cooperation would have reduced the number of coronavirus cases in their own country. In Europe, the average increases to 62%. There's an outlier right at the bottom, Denmark. If there are Danes out there in the audience, I'd love to hear your views after the session. I'll just leave it there, just for you to just look at the survey. Okay, so does the reality bear this out? This belief that international cooperation would have reduced the cases back home. So what do we intend to do in this panel is to attempt a report card on that. And from that report card, draw lessons for disease acts. As someone once said, you never want a serious crisis to go wasted. Now, we started with a quick poll around the panel to get a scoring from 1 to 10. 10 is the perfect score. If you're a teacher, how would you rate international collaboration? And within a minute as well, why do you give the score that you gave? Let's start with Ambassador.
My answer is, the score is 7, because the last 10 months, we realized that we cannot be safely for ourselves. It will be ping pong as long as any other country is left behind. So the last 10 years, we learned that how important that we are collaboration. In the first, maybe many countries is more selfish, but now everybody, every country is help each other. And hopefully, the vaccine, the DPM already mentioned that the most important thing that how the availability of the vaccine and how to make all the countries can get the vaccine.
Thank you. That's a score 7. Dr. Jamila, you're calling in from Kuala Lumpur. You can hear us well. What's your score?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to go for a generous 5. I say that because I completely agree with His Excellency the Deputy Prime Minister. The Independent Review Board has also shown that when we started with the pandemic, the multilateral cooperation wasn't really optimal. And this is a huge disappointment because we knew that the pandemic was inevitable. It was a question of when and not if, and yet we are always caught by surprise. I think part of the reason as well is that we need to ensure that we depoliticize the international system, especially the World Health Organization at the beginning of the crisis. And we need to vest authority in the UN per its mandate, as this is really one of the biggest peace and security issues of our time. I think that I give it a 5 because I see I'm an optimist. So, you start with 5, you don't fail them, but there's so much room for improvement. International collaboration has been great, but there's still a long way to go on real multilateralism.
I like your comment about being an optimist and giving a 5 score. I like to do that to my kids. All right. From Singapore, Professor Tan Cho Chuan.
So as an academic, I would say it's a 4 with a wide dispersion. And let me explain. I think if you look at the science collaboration, the information exchange, it's very good. It was 7 or 8, I would say. It worked very well. If you look at the public health response, some things worked a lot better this time around, but I would say that there's been a general failure in coordinating a global response to the pandemic. It's always easy to look back with hindsight, but if you imagine when the pandemic first started and the countries most affected were doing all the best to contain it, and if everybody else did their part to prevent transmission from taking root, then you would have a circumscribed pandemic. It would just be an outbreak in the region. But because everybody else didn't do that, when the regions were first affected recovered, other people started getting outbreaks, and then you had a globally desynchronized outbreak, which now leads to a situation which is extremely hard to contain. And the final point I want to make is that this is actually a pandemic in the full glare of a social media era. And I think more could have been done to manage the types of misinformation, disinformation that has actually complicated very greatly the public health and societal response to the pandemic. So on a weighted average with a wide dispersion, 4.
Okay, all right. Dr. Maura-Stroh?
I would say the more on the optimistic side. I shared the 7 as a score. And of course, I referred a lot to the open sharing of genome data, which is one of the interesting facets that was possible. But I also understand all the limitations and in the response, and everything can be improved.
That's good, a mix of bulls and bears. Okay, genome sequencing, we talked a bit about that in Deputy Prime Ministers, we heard that, and you just mentioned it. Let's start with that. The scientific cooperation to handle and tackle COVID-19. For this, promise we won't go technical. My last lab outing was like more than 3 decades ago, but it's difficult to avoid mentioning some key multilateral players, and I'll call up slide 2 here. It's an alphabet soup of acronyms, but it's just a primer on the screen because these names will be raised along the way. You see GISAID, which is the one in blue. Just over a year ago, this very platform was where the first fully sequenced genomes of the virus were made public to any scientist with an internet connection. Dr. Maura-Stroh, you're a scientist, and A*STAR is deeply involved in this. Could you tell us the significance of that first uploading of the sequence to GISAID?
Well, I think it's a good example that the international sharing works even across the different countries. And I have to emphasize that this was not just sharing of a single sequence. It was multiple sequences that were shared by Chinese CDC and other labs that were of high quality, that were ready for scientists to be used. And one important aspect, and we have a little slide on that.
Do you want to call it up?
Yes, please. You can actually learn a lot from having a genome. It can be part of the response. And it starts with designing your diagnostic kits in the first place. You can see which existing drugs are already working. You can also use AI and repurpose drugs. Of course, the start of creating vaccines was exactly when those genomes were shared, including for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, for example. At the same time, for public health response, you can use it for helping contact tracing. You can see the global spread, which virus has come, from which continent, from which country, and you can see if there is a cluster, and you can see if your containment measures are successful, that a certain cluster stopped. And you constantly need to watch out for these new variants, and it's very much in the news right now. And this brings us back to the very beginning, because you need to understand the virus naturally changes. And then you need to possibly update the detection kits. You need to see if the vaccines still work. And that's why actually it's not just the first genome, it's a constant sharing of genomes. And it's very important that this is not done just by one country or by few countries, but globally. That is very important.
Why were countries so willing to share the information? It's a platform, but it takes two hands to clap for people to want to make use of it.
Yeah, so that is part of the great success story. Gise, that started with avian influenza many years back, took on the task to also help with sharing the coronavirus genome. And it's been quite a remarkable sharing experience. From the Singapore side, together with many teams around the world, we have supported this effort. And we also look at the quality of the genomes. And maybe if we can look at the next slide. I'm not going to give a scientific talk here. It's just to illustrate for you, this is the rise of genomes that GISET has received from around the world. I show here the slide that was summarizing the whole last year. And you see the spread, 143 countries, so by now it's over 145. And today the number of genomes actually is 396,000. And it keeps flowing, and it's a very good experience for international cooperation. And you can also see early on there was some trend. And you can also see for ASEAN, which is very important here for us in the region, that also the partners, it's not Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia alone, almost all ASEAN states contributed. But it's also visible that the strong countries here are able to contribute, and this is important for surveillance.
So what's the status right now? Is there any fatigue that's been setting in? And obviously it's mutating right now. So the burst was good, the burst of energy. What is it looking now?
I think it's important to know that one can always improve. So there are some countries that continue contributing a lot of sequences, and some contributed some to show that they have the capability. But it's very important for this system to work, to know that the diagnostic kits work, that the vaccine is effective, that we have a continuous surveillance. And this is why the team that operates this, and many scientists, there are a lot of people to help. So the system will be running and running, but we need all the countries to continue contributing. With that effort and additional sequences, we hopefully can understand better how the virus jumps around, as was described, like a ping-ponging between countries. And the emphasis really must be the international cooperation, because securing one country is not enough. You have to eradicate or control it in as many countries as possible.
Sean, maybe if I can just interject, I would say that in general, science has become really international. And so for many years now, since before the pandemic, scientists work across many countries and collaborations. Postdocs, students study, they go to many countries, and so there are these very well-established networks that have been cooperating on many fronts. And I think what this pandemic has done has really accelerated and pushed forward this whole idea of how data sharing and the scientific collaboration across borders is so critical to find solutions. And I suspect that it's going to lead to a new inflection point where it will rebase the expectations for the extent of scientific collaboration across the world for future pandemics, but also in other areas outside of pandemics.
Dr. Jamila, would you like to chime in?
Yes, yes, indeed. I completely concur, because I think on the science part, science diplomacy, collaboration, innovation, we've been really seeing a lot of traction. But I come back to the very notion of multilateralism, and that is about governments aligning towards a common goal. Despite the fact that a COVAX facility was built, we have seen the reluctance of some major donors and major countries not wanting to participate. We've seen now vaccine nationalism still rear its ugly head. And, I just saw data that only 25 people from developing world have been vaccinated. So, and this is why I think, we've got to look at multilateralism across the spectrum, right? From the political will to, policies, and then of course, science is the much more easier thing to tackle, because basically it's very technical. It's experts who already have networks inbuilt. But I want to go back to the multilateralism in terms of ASEAN. I think ASEAN has an amazing opportunity here. I really hope that there will be a lot of learning documented. and also the opportunities to look into, I've been mooting the idea of an ASEAN CDC, so to speak, that helps us look at, low cost solutions for the region, and also look at, pooling our resources and ideas around innovation. I can't imagine why we can't have a mechanism that if the ASEAN sort of bloc endorses a certain vaccine or gives it approval, that the other countries in ASEAN, can actually take that as a regional sort of agreement. So I think there's so much more room for improvement on the multilateral side.
Do you think the internationally, COVAX is facing quite a bit of headwinds? Do you think it'll be a lot easier at the ASEAN level? Because the countries are pretty disparate in terms of development as well.
I think we need to try. I think that COVID has given us a massive dress rehearsal for the future. So, yes, there are, but, I will remind all of us that ASEAN is the emerging economy in the world. So no doubt there's disparate economies at the moment. The potential for ASEAN to grow and to become stronger is there. Of course, we have to get over the terrible economic consequences of the pandemic right now. But we need to start looking at a systems approach to the region. How do we address this? I want to go back to the very fundamental of the pandemic. This is not a health crisis that emerged on its own. This emerged because we, in the Anthropocene age, have really violated our planetary boundaries. We have, had massive urbanization, destruction of environment. The release of zoonotic diseases is not something that happens spontaneously. There's a disconnect between looking at sustainable development goals, the climate agenda, the health agenda. There has to be, us bringing it together. And what I foresee is the next big move, and that is planetary health. And that, until and unless we have these conversations that are linked, then we will forever be looking at things from one point of view and not having a holistic approach to how we prevent, how we address, how we anticipate, and how do we then be able to be resilient and adaptable in combating future crises. So I hope Singapore will really lead in this. I think we need an Asia-Pacific Planetary Health Center, if not a global one. Asia is the disaster supermarket, so to speak, and as well as many pandemics starting from this region. We have to lead now. I challenge all of us that we are a region that needs to lead.
Okay.
I think interesting sound from the ASEAN perspective. The leaders at the last ASEAN summit have already agreed to set up what we call ASEAN Center for Public Health for Emerging diseases. I think this is the idea is come out from the leaders that ASEAN must be thinking as a one and how to respond if we have the next pandemic. So I think this is the one thing that ASEAN have moved forward and thinking about for the next diseases. And Indonesia itself have already proposed to become the host for the ASEAN Center for Public Health. I think I'm fully agreed with Dr. Jamila that how the ASEAN must be more make a cooperation. And for the experience in Indonesia, so I think Ekman Institute have a very close cooperation with the ASTAR to develop about the diagnostic for the COVID-19 test. So it's the example that actually in ASEAN, we have made a lot of cooperation. Indonesia and Temasek Foundation, I think the partnership between Indonesia in the Temasek Foundation is very, very good. I just 2 months in Singapore, and most of our job in the last 2 months is how to make a connecting with our colleague from the Temasek. And many things that we have done in the field that once, for the example, for digital tracing, we cooperate with the Temasek Foundation. Now we borrow at least 500 token of Blue Pass, and we starting to implementing and make a trial in the task force office in Jakarta. So once is, I think this is the one of the example that the collaboration in ASEAN is have already exists.
So Sean, if I may, I think the question is not should we be country level, regional level, global. In fact, you need all three. You need multiple layers of defense. And in a large country, you need actually coordination within the country. And then if different regions coordinated better, then you'd have less moving parts. But you also need a super layer of global cooperation, because some things, frankly, can only be managed at the global level. In relation to COVAX, I don't know whether you want to talk about it now. It is a ship that's being built as being sailed. Because it started off with Gavi, which procured for countries that receive donated types of vaccines. But also now we have self-financing countries, high-income countries coming together. And this is unprecedented. And the rules are being developed as we're going along. So in a way, our expectation for COVAX might not be that it delivers vaccines on day one together with all the rich countries. I think we have to compare with the historical norm, where the low-income countries will be far, far behind. If COVAX is able to deliver it faster and in much greater quantities, and by doing so bring the acute phase of the pandemic to an end faster, then I think it would have made a huge contribution. And the successes of COVAX, building on what has been built now, I think then we'll be able to refine it so that it will be able to respond in a much faster and a much coordinated manner. I mean, today we are just working out the rules, how
I appreciate
to do
it's
this.
a work in progress.
Yeah.
I just want to call up this slide, which I've prepared anyway. It's a slide 3, and it goes exactly aligned to what you're talking about. The theory is good. The construct is fabulous. No one would dispute an equitable distribution and access for all countries to vaccines. But the truth is actually something else in terms of how some countries are hoarding, some countries have actually opted out of COVAX. And you did talk about, yeah, we need to fix some things. What are these things that we need to fix right now? Because you're really closely involved in the COVAX discussions.
I think the first set of things is to procure together, which means that you have to decide on which are the candidates which are promising and how to make advanced procurements, and to have a mechanism to do at-risk financing. And I think that's largely in place, needs to be built out. And then after that, it's really getting the doses and delivering them. That's the part that I think the expectation is for it to come much faster. But the reality, I think, is going to lag a bit. But there's an element of COVAX that is still being discussed, which is the exchange mechanism, meaning that there will be countries around the world that have far too many vaccine doses. Some countries have doses
5 times?
3 to 5 times in excess of what they need. And COVAX could potentially be a multilateral platform that allows an exchange to occur, which then enhances access of countries that have not had access so far. So this is still being discussed. It's not been developed yet, but I think it's part of the solutioning that's occurring at the multilateral platform level at a global, looking at global scenarios. And the more such effective tools that we have at the multilateral level, then the better prepared we'll be for future pandemics. And I think it will still make a contribution for the current pandemic.
Good. Mindful of the time, please send in your questions for those, whether you're watching us on streaming or whether you're in the audience here. There is a question that's come up here in terms of lessons to be shared. It's great to share good lessons. What about the bad lessons? How willing are countries in terms of bearing their warts and all to tell you, we've gone wrong here, don't go down that path? What do you think of that sort of rising above all the insecurities or the nationalism to actually share information in a very, very open way? What do you think, Ambassador?
I think, once again, all the countries now is realized that COVID-19 we must call as the disease of tomorrow. Nobody knows but what kind of the virus and how we can handle it. I want to the experience of Indonesia, beginning when we founded the COVID case and outbreak has happened in Indonesia. The first cases is announced is 2nd of March. And after that, the WHO called the pandemic status. And then the President, Joko Widodo, is set up the task force of COVID-19 on 13th of March. And the first week, I still remember, because I'm a member of the task force COVID-19 in Indonesia. The first weeks of after the President set up the task force, 9 medical doctors in Indonesia is passed away. The most of them is not because they are treat the patient who have infected the COVID-19. 4 of them is a dentist. This is the example that the COVID-19 is the new diseases that we don't know exactly what kind of this virus. So that's why for the Indonesia, I think Indonesia is open, is willingness to cooperate and to share about and knowing about what is really happened and how that we can be respond about this the virus. So I think the proposal and now the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia have already elected as a co-chair for the COVAX. This is the show that the Indonesia is still open and no barrier at all to cooperate and also share the data about the COVID-19.
Okay, I want to go beyond the science. We've got like 20 minutes left of the discussion into supply chains. We've seen the shortages of masks, PPEs, sanitizers. We're not even going to talk about toilet paper shortages. But a lot of it's born out of export bans, interdictions, self-interest, really. How do we do better for the next pandemic? Any opening up to any one of you, just jump in. I know there's an idea of ASEAN stockpiling, but please, by all means, throw in your ideas.
Maybe start the ball rolling. I think that the best time to deal with the pandemic is right at the beginning. So we know that, and it's really amply demonstrated by COVID. And in order to respond early and with sufficient intensity, it requires preparedness. And preparedness, the level of preparedness at the country level, at the global level. And what we've seen in COVID, of course, is that this varied greatly around the world. And I think that what would really help in terms of mitigating supply chain impact and enhancing the public health response in the future is to elevate the preparedness level at country level, at regional level, and at the global level. And at the global level, we also have to provide for countries which don't have the capacity to have in-depth defense. In other words, stockpiles, experts, emergency financing, the ability to deploy resources in areas where the capacity does not exist. So if we could do this much more effectively, I think we'll have a much better chance at the next pandemic to try to contain it when it's beginning. That is the most difficult period because you worry about overreacting. But once the pandemic gets to the level where countries are in a somewhat desperate situation, then it's really very hard at that point to then try to find mitigating solutions.
Dr. Morrow?
I think it's very important to learn from what has worked, and we can reflect that actually over the previous experiences from 2009 or 2003 SARS, there are a lot of improvements, but the experiences can be different. For example, in 2003, sequencing was not so common. It took 2 months for the first genome to become available in the database, and now we can do this in days. And what has also happened is because of this technology, many countries around the world have the capability, but they also need the supplies for doing that. And the same supplies in the case of RNA extraction is one of the steps that is needed, both for most of the diagnostic kits, as well as for the sequencing. There was a shortage of it. And it's really a logistic distribution problem. where are those places? And having a structure where there is a global connectivity, but including regional centers that have enough available to distribute to their countries, may be one of the solutions. For the DC6 and looking forward in the future, we need to be aware if there are technological changes, that we follow that pace so that we are prepared for that new technology that will be applied then. We don't have holes in the supply chain.
We didn't expect shortages of reagents, did we? Okay, Dr. Jamila, do you have a view out of KL?
As someone who's worked in crisis for more than 2 decades, preparedness is key. And I think with this crisis, we have a real opportunity. The United Nations, the international organizations have humanitarian response depots all over the world. And I think what we need to do is look at how do public health emergencies, preparedness link with other humanitarian crises, and therefore what needs to be positioned, your inventory list, and all that. But I want to maybe put a little bit of spotlight on something else. When we were in our mad scramble to get PPEs, disposable masks, and so on and so forth, I think we never thought about the environmental impact of the things we used. And I think we will be dealing with another crisis of all these disposables that are going to end up in the sea. So I think at this point in reflection and moving forward, we need to think about how we push industries to be much more environmental friendly in preparing stocks that are required in large scale crises like this. But may I just turn back to something? Let's do a reality check. The reality check is that it's very, very much community-based. The virus starts and the disease starts in the communities. The solutions must also come from communities. And where pandemics have been managed well, and I've been involved in Ebola and all that in West Africa, is when communities themselves participate, because behavioral change is the key to ending pandemics. This is something that I think we have to learn a lot about. And on your question about will countries share failure, I think Sweden was very courageous to say that their approach to herd immunity was not the right one, and I think that we learn best from sometimes the failures that we make. So I think I would encourage that we have honest conversations as part of a learning process.
Thank you. There's a question now. I'll just sort of take a different tack now and talk a bit about recovery. I know we're staring at surges right now. It's a bit difficult to think about recovery, but as we recover, this question goes, how can the international community collaborate in post-pandemic recovery? For example, transboundary supply chains, travel bubbles. And I do have a question on travel bubbles to supplement, to add on to that as well. Right now, we're seeing a patchwork of rules, regulations, quarantines, even in terms of how you prove you've got that vaccination or the PCR test. Is this what it is that we've got to contend with? Rules, different countries, and at different times the rules could change as well. Is there a way we could do better in terms of encouraging the reopening of borders? Ambassador, would you like to have a go at that?
Son, once again, one thing that we must understand that the carrier of the virus of COVID-19 is not animal. The carrier is people. Once the people is let their freedom go everywhere, it will be dangerous, especially because so many asymptomatic people, it can be infected the other. So I think what the Singaporeans have already done, especially to control the foreigners to coming and 14 days, I think the good things to once again to protect Singapore. That's why we're trying to take the lesson learned from Singapore. Maybe Indonesia is different, it's too huge. But once again, we have already discussing with the head of the task force in Indonesia, possibility to put more smaller in the island, for example, for the Bintan. Once we can have control the Bintan, and like Singapore, we can implementing how the way to handle the contagious between the people. I think the travel bubble could be possible to implementing not from Singapore to Indonesia, but Singapore to Batam. That's one example. But once again, I think Now is the most important thing is how to control the contagious. Because once again, comparing to the SARS, I think COVID-19 is less fatal. But the contagious is more fast comparing to the SARS. So this is the very dangerous, the contagious. So the content of the people who infected is, I think, is more important.
Bilateral. And what about at the international travel? Is there a case for greater harmonization?
I think the conversations will start concurrently at different levels, but the reality is that the timeframes of the resolution will be very different for a couple of reasons. The first reason is we are having a desynchronized pandemic, and the countries that are severely affected now, their priority must be to contain the serious spread and to bring new case numbers down to a level where control through contact tracing and quarantine becomes feasible. You need to get to that baseline because otherwise it's very, very hard to contemplate very serious reopening or reconnection. On the other hand, countries which are already containing or are on the way to containing the outbreaks, I think are in a better position to start to develop travel bubbles, trade reopening, re-engagement. And so I think we need to have conversations at the different levels. It would be ideal to have greater standardization, which is evidence-informed, in terms of testing regimes for travel, quarantine requirements, what to do with vaccinated people. Eventually, you will need to have a unified standard. But practically, we should expect that the initial cooperation will be amongst countries, like-minded countries, who have a similar pandemic situation. And perhaps there could be opportunities for the learnings from those earlier engagements to be taken up at a more global level.
Thank you. Dr. Jamila?
Yes, I completely agree with that, because I think at the end of the day, borders are under sovereign control, and each country will want to ensure that it protects its citizens, and it is one of the requisites of even WHO standards, as managing your borders as a requisite. I fear, though, I must be honest, that if we come to a time where, say, there is a travel passport, will we be having unequal sort of opportunities for the developing world to actually travel? Because again, linked to the vaccines availability, equity distribution, and so on and so forth. So I completely agree. It's really work in progress. It has to be similarly, similar circumstances that different countries are facing, that might have to experiment within that realm before we can actually look at a much more global approach. But maybe regionally we can start already experimenting and looking at some mechanisms that might work.
Thank you. I've got questions coming in. We've got 5 more minutes. Please send in your questions. There's a question on ASEAN from Lin Tan. How can ASEAN's potential be emphasized for a true ASEAN solution to COVID-19 and future crises? How can ASEAN nations be incentivized to cooperate rather than prioritize their own interests first?
I think there is a hotspot interface between animals and humans where new diseases can emerge. So if we have to be prepared that new diseases will come, and exactly the area where it can emerge, a lot of effort can be put in. And in order to allow this to happen, and it's capability building, but also it requires trusted mechanisms to share the findings. GISET originally was founded also in the terms of the avian influenza crisis. And Indonesia was one of the countries that shared freely through GISAID this data. And this is because they trusted the system that also the information will not be taken by other people, by big countries, and used for their own purposes. So with the confidence that as a region here, we trust each other, and the mechanism itself is sustainable for global sharing, I think there is a great potential to be tackling also future diseases.
All right.
Yeah, I think that on the research side, there's a lot of scope for us to do more. I think Sebastian mentioned a very important one, which is the interface between people and animals, where people and animals mix very, very freely. That's where the next epidemic is likely to come from. But also in the area of clinical trials. I just like two brief examples. We look at trials of therapeutic agents, and if one country like Singapore has lower number of cases, but there are many cases in another country in ASEAN, then by cooperating, we can actually advance the trials much faster, and then all of us can benefit from the fruits of the discoveries. So clinical trials would be an important area where I think we could do even more work together. The other example I'll give is environmental transmission. Because how do we develop the evidence base to judge how much we need to do in terms of mask wearing, density in a room, social distance, etc. It would be good for us to derive data on transmission potential. And so in Singapore, we actually have been starting to do that, but we ran out of cases to carry out the studies on. It would actually be very ideal if we were able to work with our regional partners in order to advance these studies, and that data would then be useful for everybody, because it can then help us to calibrate the different types of safe management measures we put in place, and to understand the relative value of the different things that we do.
It reminds us when we ran out of cases, Temasek is actually right now partnering Indonesian and Philippine hospitals to test and validate the various tests that we've got. Any last thoughts on this matter around the table in terms of ASEAN cooperation or collaboration?
I'm
3 minutes.
interested with what the Dr. Jamilah mentioned previously about the community for her experience in Africa. I think also in the COVID-19 cases experience that the most important thing is how to educate the people, because we think about the in high level collaboration, but as long as the community we can give the enough education, I think it's very dangerous. Once again, for the Indonesian example, we're trying to educate the people, and how the way to bring the people more understand is we learn from the New Zealand experience, how the media can take a role to not only blaming and complaining, but media have a role to educate the people, how to avoid to infect the COVID-19. Once you have infected, what you must do. New Zealand is very excellent, especially for the media. The role of the media is very important. So that's why, from the Indonesian experience, because I'm experienced as the journalist. First, that I'm doing when I'm joined with the task force is how to bring the mainstream media, not only once again to complaining, but how to educate the people. Fortunately, Prof. Tan, now 891 mainstream media, from television, radio, printing media, online media, now supported the government to educate the people. I think the most important thing that the Ibu Dr. Jamilah have already mentioned, how we teach and educate the community.
Fantastic. All right. Okay. Any last questions in the room itself? Oh, Dr. Jamilah, you want to? Yeah, please join us.
Yeah, on your question on ASEAN, ASEAN has great aspirations. One ASEAN, one response, prosper thy neighbor. It needs to now, basically crudely put your money where your mouth is, right? I mean, basically what happens in ASEAN is that we think of great institutions and build these things. I love the idea of AFID, the ASEAN Public Health in Emergencies and Emerging Diseases, but we've got to look at the sustainability of the centers, and therefore there has to be a commitment from ASEAN member states to actually fund systems, establishments that actually benefit the greater good. ASEAN is a region of is it 300 million people,
Yes.
and a 3 trillion economy, 600 million people, 3 trillion economy. I think we've got to really invest in the region. I think I am a complete multilateralist, globalist, but I also feel that the world has evolved so fast and changed so fast, and disruptions affect different regions, different countries, and different contexts in different ways. So we need to be much more diversified in finding solutions as well.
Thank you. I want to thank the panelists. We're running out of time, half a minute more.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insights on science, collaborations, supply chains, ASEAN planetary health. Wish you all the best.
Yeah.
While COVID-19 has been a wake-up call, it's also shown us that we can work together. And so I just want to thank the audience as well for your contributions and for listening. Thank you.